Everybody, thank you so much for having me. I do apologize. My colleague is much better looking and more charismatic, but this is what you're stuck with. And additionally, so we will touch on politics. I did want to give that warning. So if you have a bloodlust or are going to assault your neighbor or me, just, now's the time to remove yourself from the room. So first, we're just going to focus on the federal policy issues. As I'm sure you're all aware, the restaurant industry is pretty unique in the sense that we touch on almost every issue possible. So if you're an animal rights group, right, you're just focused on animal rights. When you bring in the supply chain, we have every issue possible. So here's just a few that are kind of on the front burner right now. So as you're probably all aware, earlier this year, the federal menu labeling regulations went into effect. I don't know if that affects many of you right now because it's only effective on, I believe it's organizations with 20 or more chains, but as you're growing, it's certainly something to be aware of. Additionally, within the first year, the FDA will not, or they say they're not going to enforce it. They're there to educate you. Commissioner Gottlieb has made that very clear. So, you're in the clear for right now. And the reason why this was very important is just that so many cities and states were instituting their own laws. And as you would know from a chain, it's impossible or it's extraordinarily expensive and can limit your growth if you have to comply with a bunch of different, not even just states, I mean like hundreds of different sets of rules. So we wanted one national standard for everybody, and the FDA would still have an ability to modify what goes forward, but this was incredible. We worked for 11 years on it, actually. Healthcare. So everybody remembers the Affordable Care Act, often referred to as Obamacare, which created a ton of new regulations for businesses that they need to comply with, including the employer mandate, onerous reporting requirements, the definition of an employee, which was randomly made to be 30 hours instead of what everybody assumes it to be, which is 40 hours. So we've been working with both Congress and the administration on rolling back some of these. So as you can see there, the House will plan, I think because of the hurricane, they postponed it until next week, but they're going to vote on the Save American Workers Act to roll that back, and then we're working with the Senate to try to get support and perhaps get that 40-hour, or excuse me, full-time employee definition changed back to 40 hours a week instead of 30 for the purposes of being required to provide them with health care. Additionally, I'm not sure if you're aware, but this year we rolled out our association health plan. So the White House issued an order to expand AHPs, and AHPs allow smaller employers to band together and really drive down the premiums for healthcare. So, and one of the nice things is AHPs are exempt from many of the Affordable Care Act's requirements. That's how they can get the lower premiums. And so our plan for our members is available to any restaurant that's a size between 2 and 99 employees. And so this was huge. And we're also I believe, one of 3 plans that are actually grandfathered in under the law. So this was just an enormous win for our industry. And if you're having an issue with retaining employees because they want benefits or need healthcare coverage, I'd highly recommend you looking into that. And then we can move into the main issue, which I'm sure all of you are aware for our industry. We call it workforce development. Our top challenge for years has been the recruitment and retention of qualified employees. And it's probably top 1, 2, and 3. Every restaurant operator complains about this. It's impossible to find people. It's impossible to keep them for longer. And there are certain solutions that we all know will just work, and that's what we're, in Washington trying to happen. So the first would be comprehensive immigration reform. We're supporting it. We're aware many of you are supporting it. Frankly, a lot more members of Congress support it than they're willing to publicly say. But in the interim before that, we would like permanent H-2B visa cap relief. So we were able to, I believe there's 66,000 of these visas given out every year. A lot of you probably rely on them. They also go like that. They're gone as soon as they're issued. So we were able to get tens of thousands more issued for this year, but that just needs to be permanently extended and permanently expanded. Moreover, the Dreamer issue, we know it's contentious, but we fully support finding a pathway to legalize the 800,000 Dreamers who came here under the Deferred Action Childhood program, or DACA program. And we all know that it's hard for you to verify employees who would like to work for you, and it would make it a lot easier to have a universal standard. So we've been pushing these. It's just an incredibly difficult issue. It didn't happen under the Obama administration or the Bush administration. In fact, it hasn't happened since the Reagan administration. So in lieu of that, we're also focusing on other workforce expansion. So the apprenticeship program is huge. The White House has been focused like a laser, including Secretary Acosta, who we speak with quite often, on expanding apprenticeships and the workforce to find people to here who can inject much needed lifeblood into our industry. So we were put on one of 20 organizations put on this task force on apprenticeships, and we will have 3,500 new apprentices, I believe, in the next 2 years. We also signed on to the administration's pledge to Save America workers, and over the next 5 years, we're going to have recruit an additional 370,000 people. That's what we've pledged into our industry. So the one good thing under this administration is that they very much understand your needs, our needs, and are committed to finding ways to make all of your lives easier. I think the last poll I saw had Congress's approval rating at around 12%. I imagine after this slide, if we polled you, it would be in the single digits. So unfortunately, you probably all remember the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which passed December of 2017. It's great. Lowered the corporate tax rate, lowered the pass-through tax rate, individual rates. Fantastic. Unfortunately, when Congress was drafting it, they had an inadvertent error. So previously, prior to tax reform going through, you had a 15-year recovery for qualified improvement property and 50% bonus depreciation for it. Okay? Congress intended to keep that 15 years, but make it 100% for the bonus depreciation. But what did they actually do? They messed up. And so now it's a 39-year recovery period and back to 50% bonus depreciation. So worse off than actually before tax reform went through. This right now is probably our #1 issue that we're all fighting for in Washington. What it looks like right now would be that we would pass or would get something included in what's known as the lame duck session. So that takes place after the midterm elections, before the next Congress begins. So typically how the Congress will work, they're going to pass an omnibus or a continuing resolution to bring them into the next calendar year. It's going to be a massive bill that's going to include everything, kitchen sink, whatever. So that's what we're pushing for, to have this included. Frankly, lawmakers are aware of the problem. It has bipartisan support to be fixed. What sucks is, but what's terrible is that politics really is driving this. So Democrats are understandably upset that Republicans didn't include them in tax negotiations. And the Republican response, of course, is that you didn't include us in the healthcare negotiations. I mean, it's asinine, because what that leads to is just all of you getting hurt. So Democrats so far have been uncooperative. However, we feel just because the way things work in the lame duck, this will be a must-pass bill. And so it's the best vehicle within which to fix this really terrible, terrible error. I mean, many of members of Congress have been fantastic. They've written to the IRS saying, hey, this was not our intent. You can clearly see that in the bill report language, yada, yada, yada. But the one way to really get this fixed is to actually just amend the law. So, and this goes into a broader discussion of that, of basically why we're here. It's really important for all of you to be engaged. You really can influence the debate. when tax reform was being debated, the 45B, you're probably aware of it, the FICA tax tip credit, because they were considering flattening and just getting rid of so many provisions of the code, it was really important to restaurants that remain within the code. And one of the big reasons why it did is because some people within some of our members, they grew up with some of these people in Congress, and they picked up their cell phone and they called them and told them to keep it in. I mean, actually, they called the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. So any relationships that you have, it's really, really important to leverage them. We can do so much being in Washington, but if you're seeing these people in your town, they're visiting your restaurants, that's really powerful. When you say, if this doesn't happen, 5 people are gonna be laid off. It's a massive influence there. Again, I just cannot emphasize that enough. So call your congressman. Joint employer. I assume most of you are aware of it. If not, essentially, it's who's responsible for an employee. Their benefits, legal liability, and whatnot. For 30 years, you had to have direct and immediate control over the essential conditions of employment, so hiring, firing, wages, things like that. In 2015, the NLRB changed that to an indirect control standard. This is a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare, not just for restaurants, but for every business. So if you have, let's just say, a janitorial service who comes, and helps clean your restaurant, previously under a direct control standard, more than likely that's an independent contractor who, you just entered into a contract with. Under the new indirect control standard, you could be liable for everything. That includes if the employees want to organize, any kind of lawsuits, and it's such an amorphous definition that it's just insane. Even the courts are like, they wonder if they have enough manpower to deal with the amount of lawsuits that could arise from this. So, oh my God, what a nightmare, Washington. So the new NLRB, under this administration, they returned to the old standard. But then, shortly thereafter, there was a conflict of interest. So now it's the old new standard is back in place. Finally, the NLRB has just decided last week that they issued a proposed rule, or notice of proposed rulemaking, that they are going to attempt to return to the old pre-2015 direct control standard. Again, this is hugely, hugely important to all of you. And if you own other businesses besides restaurants, it's every business that you can possibly be involved in. And that's great. Like, we're really pushing, we're working with the NLRB and the Department of Labor on this issue. But the best way to solve this is to have it codified in law, to actually have this in legislation and get it out of the board's hands. So we're pushing, and we were instrumental in getting the Save Local Business Act passed in the House, and we're trying to build support for it in the Senate. Again, that support and that pressure comes from all of you. I mean, Congress and politics in general, remember, it's a reactive institution. If it can, it will just do nothing, right? I mean, that's its natural state. So you have to apply pressure to force it to act. So the tip credit, this was the 80-20 rule. That's what it's normally referred to as. So anytime an employee who works more than 20% of their time, non-tipped duties will have to be paid the full minimum wage. This has been also, it's a confusing thing. Multiple administrations have been trying to define what this is for years. At the end of the Bush administration, they did release what's called an opinion letter, and it seemed to solve it. It was great. And the Obama administration, as soon as it came into office, rescinded that letter. So we're pushing to have that reinstated, what's called the Passantino opinion letter. But again, there's just been going back and forth. So the Restaurant Law Center finally had enough, and we've actually filed suit on this issue, saying that the Department of Labor, failed to follow proper rulemaking guidance when they actually made this decision. and DOL is going to be expected to respond here in mid-November. A lot of rules. Yes, the overtime rule. As probably many of you know, certain positions are exempt from overtime rules, typically referred to as like administrative, professional, executive, things like that. But they also have to meet a certain salary threshold. In 2016, the previous administration more than doubled that threshold. Obviously, this can cause a massive issue for all of you and for many businesses. Thankfully, it was enjoined by a federal court, and the Department of Labor has said, okay, and they're going to start holding listening sessions to actually determine what a realistic and tenable actual threshold to put in. You can go to the Department of Labor's website and actually see if they're holding a listening session in a city near you and participate. I'd highly recommend it. Again, the people, the end product will be with the people who are at the table. So just make sure you're at the table as much as possible. ADA reform, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Some of you may have been unfortunate enough to have encountered this. And a lot of times it's dealing with, I don't know if it's the most hated or second most hated profession in America with the trial attorneys who basically institute drive-by lawsuits. You know, they'll see that one little thing is out of whack, and the next thing you know, you're just hit with a lawsuit. You have no chance. You're not given notice. You're not given time to cure the defect. You know, it's just a massive, just a massive lawsuit and headache that you have to deal with. So we were able to get the ADA Education Reform Act passed in the House, and we do actually are building some bipartisan support for it in the Senate, which is good, and especially with Senators Flake from Arizona and Senator Feinstein from California. Additionally, website accessibility lawsuits. This is another nightmare brought on by the government's inaction. So the ADA applies to websites. That's what the Department of Justice has said. And then they were kind enough not to give any of you any guidance on how you should actually construct your website to comply with this. So anyway, we're pushing them to actually institute this. We just had a few of the top Senate leaders send a letter to Attorney General Jeff Sessions to begin resolving this issue. All right. So midterms. It's going to be interesting. Right now, the last thing I've heard was that Republicans will they have a 1 out of 5 chance of retaining their House majority. On the other hand, Democrats only have a 1 in 5 chance of gaining the Senate majority. So the next Congress is going to be very interesting looking. Additionally, there's a lot of discussion of waves, and God only knows what can happen. I mean, there's 49 days until the next election, and in this time, that is a lifetime. So, but right now, it looks like whoever wins will have a very small majority, which will make governing very, very difficult. I mean, you've seen it even with Republicans in this over the past 2 years. They can't get on the same page, and it's made, moving legislation difficult. And Democrats will probably have that same issue should they gain the majority, because many of their new members will probably be super conservative or super liberal, and it's hard to bring those folks on the same page. Trump's approval numbers, I don't even know why I included that slide because they fluctuate so much on a daily basis. So this just kind of shows you, if past is prologue, with some of those presidential numbers in the last wave elections, what they look like. And you can see it's pretty substantial. So in the House, Democrats need to net 23 seats. And quite honestly, that's on the low end. So that's, just more ground of why they're probably going to win, or makes it more likely that they'll, regain that. On the other hand, the Democrats are defending 24 seats in the Senate compared to only the 10 for Republicans, which gives Republicans a much greater chance of retaining that majority. So it looks like we're actually going to have a split government. Again, this chart is probably 4 days old, and it's already out of date. And the other thing to remember, especially the National Restaurant Association, we are often focused on federal issues. These are national things. I mean, Americans with Disabilities Act is a prime example. But so many of your issues are decided at the state and local level, arguably most of them. This is showing how many states are just having different ballot initiatives this year, and that's going to be on everything from increasing the minimum wage to paid family leave programs. And I can provide Andy with copies of these to distribute if anybody's interested. The tip credit, that's a big thing. You see a lot more states and even localities actually just completely eliminating it now. This is a big thing for groups like Rock and Fight for 15, who are really pushing this. Again, we have maps, this just shows the minimum wage rates all across the country, and now it's, gone into even just localities. And then just, and scheduling legislation, that's become the new, the next frontier that you're all gonna have to defend against, and that is incredibly onerous, and it's gaining a lot of traction with especially much more progressive states and cities. So, and now just kind of flew through that, but we'll open it up to any questions. It's a depressing topic. My pleasure.